The flashing lights were silent. They were always silent when they came to her house now, a courtesy she wasn't sure she deserved or even wanted. Red and blue strobed across the vinyl siding of her porch, catching the weary lines around Sarah Jenkins' eyes and painting the peeling trim in frantic, temporary colors. The Oregon night was damp and cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones with the promise of a long winter ahead. Rain was beginning to speckle the dusty hood of the police cruiser parked at the end of her gravel driveway. Officer Miller stood before her, his posture a study in practiced apology. His hat was in his hands, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "Sarah, you know I don't want to be here," he began, the words worn smooth from repetition. He held up a clipboard as if it were a shield. But Janice called again. Said your guests were making too much noise. And this time Councilman Redding called the chief directly. They say you're violating Town Ordinance 113.8b, the one about unauthorized encampments. Sarah let out a breath that wasn't a laugh but wasn't a sigh, either. It was the sound of utter exhaustion. It's not an encampment, Miller. It's people. It's 7 o'clock. The children were singing a song. That's the noise. She hugged her thin cardigan tighter around herself, the fabric doing little to ward off the chill. They're cold and they're hungry. You want to see their authorization? Go ask the people who dropped 57 human beings at a condemned building and drove away. See what their clipboard says. Miller winced. Look, I'm just doing your job, Sarah finished for him, the words tasting like ash. I know. He gave a helpless shrug and retreated to his car, the silent light show ceasing as he drove away. Sarah remained on the porch, watching his taillights disappear, leaving her alone with the encroaching darkness and the quiet, desperate sounds of life emanating from her backyard. It had only been 72 hours. 72 hours since her life had been blessedly, boringly normal. 3 days ago, her world had been defined by the antiseptic smell and controlled chaos of the Havenwood Regional Hospital ER. A 12-hour shift was a blur of beeping monitors, the squeak of soft-soled shoes on linoleum, and the constant, low-grade adrenaline of patching up the results of car crashes, kitchen accidents, and bar fights. Sarah moved through it with a practiced, almost detached competence that had been forged in the dust and heat of 2 tours as a combat medic in Afghanistan. She could set a bone, run a line, and talk a panicked patient off a ledge without her heart rate climbing above 80. That night, she'd come home to the profound silence of the house she'd inherited from her parents. It was too big for one person, a 2-acre island of semi-rural quiet on the edge of town. She'd heated a frozen lasagna that tasted of freezer burn and regret and settled onto her couch, the local news flickering on the television. That's when she saw it. The report was framed as a local curiosity, a logistical snafu. A federal refugee processing center in Portland had overflowed. A charter bus, its manifest filled with families from Syria and Afghanistan, had been rerouted due to a cascade of bureaucratic failures. The driver, following his last garbled instruction, had deposited his passengers at the designated Regional Support Center. The problem was, Havenwood Support Center was a derelict community hall, boarded up and condemned for a decade. The driver, his contract fulfilled, had simply driven away. The report showed a brief, grainy shot of dark figures huddled near the crumbling brick building, before cutting to a smarmy, well-coiffed councilman, Mark Redding. "We are investigating the situation," Redding said, his voice smooth as polished granite. "We must ensure all protocols are followed before any action is taken." Protocols. The word snagged in Sarah's brain. She thought of the protocols for treating a sucking chest wound, for applying a tourniquet under fire. Protocols were for action, not for sitting in a warm studio while people sat in the cold. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She was tired. She'd done her part in another country, for other people. But the image of those huddled figures wouldn't leave her. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her keys, her mind running through the contents of the trauma bag she always kept in her trunk. The scene at the old hall was worse than the news had let on. It was a tableau of silent despair. Families were clustered together for warmth against the peeling paint of the boarded-up entrance. Children, their faces smudged with dirt, stared with wide, unblinking eyes. The air was still and cold, the only sound the rustle of leaves and a dry, persistent cough coming from a small girl wrapped in a thin blanket, her head resting on her mother's lap. Sarah's medic instincts, dormant but never gone, flared to life. This was a mass casualty incident, just without the blood. Starvation, dehydration, Hypothermia, they were killers too. They were just slower. She approached the family with the coughing child. "I'm a nurse," she said softly, holding up her hands. "Can I help?" The father, a man with the weary, intelligent eyes of someone who had lost everything but his dignity, nodded. The little girl was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow. Sarah returned to her car and grabbed her kit. It wasn't much, but it was something. She gave the girl, whose name she learned was Amina, a dose of children's ibuprofen. She passed out bottles of water and the stale granola bars from her glove compartment. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol, a temporary, almost meaningless gesture. As she drove home, she knew, with a sinking certainty, that it wouldn't be enough. The next day, nothing had changed. The official response from the town of Havenwood was a deafening silence. The mayor was still conveniently on vacation. Councilman Redding had issued another statement, this time about the complex legalities of jurisdictional responsibility. It was a masterclass in saying nothing, a political filibuster against human need. Sarah finished her ER shift, feeling a familiar, cold anger coalesce in her chest. She drove back to the community hall. The families were still there, only now they looked more desperate, more exposed. A local news van was parked across the street, its camera filming from a safe, sterile distance. And she noticed a familiar sedan parked a little ways down the road. Inside, her next-door neighbor, Janice Cowell, sat watching, her face a tight mask of disapproval. Sarah didn't stop. She drove straight home, the image of Amina's feverish face burned into her mind. She walked into her small home office, the one her father used to use for his accounting business, and sat down at the desk. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face in the dim room. The online banking portal loaded. Checking account, 4. 109.22. Savings account, 84, 321.57. $84,000. It was a fortress. It was the fruit of 2 tours in a war zone, of combat pay and hazard bonuses she diligently saved. It was the money from the sale of her parents' assets after they passed. It was her Futura down payment on a condo somewhere, warm, an escape hatch from the grueling ER shifts, a buffer against the terrifying uncertainties of the world. It was the physical manifestation of her security, her independence. She stared at the numbers, her heart pounding. She thought of the promises she'd made to herself, to stay out of it, to not get involved. She had done her time. She had earned her peace. Then, she thought of the hollow look in the eyes of the fathers, the fierce, protective stares of the mothers. She thought of the quiet, dignified man, Yusuf, Amina's father, who had thanked her for a single bottle of water with the grace of a king. She thought of protocols and jurisdictions and the utter failure of a system to see the human beings caught in its gears. She had seen this before. In bombed-out villages and dusty field hospitals, the look of abandonment. The only difference was the backdrop. It wasn't the Hindu Kush Mountains. It was the manicured lawns and towering pines of Havenwood, Oregon. But the need was the same. The suffering was the same. She closed her eyes, took a ragged breath, and made a decision that would unravel her life. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door, leaving the laptop open, the balance on the screen glowing like a final monument to the life she was about to leave behind. Her first stop was Costco. The cavernous warehouse felt alien, a temple of suburban excess. She pushed one of the giant flatbed carts through the aisles, her movements sharp and decisive. She wasn't shopping for one. She was provisioning an army. 100-pound bags of rice, 50-pound sacks of pinto beans and lentils, cases of canned tomatoes, corn, and green beans stacked high, giant blocks of cheese, flats of eggs, an entire pallet of toilet paper, diapers in 3 different sizes, canisters of baby formula. The cart was a mountain of survival. People stared. The cashier, a young man with a pierced eyebrow, looked from the towering pile of goods to Sarah's determined face, his eyes wide. "Big party?" he asked, his voice laced with awe. "Something like that," Sarah said, her voice flat. The bill was staggering. 312.89. She paid with her debit card, the transaction draining her checking account almost completely. She didn't flinch. It took 2 trips in her Ford F-150 to ferry the supplies home. She didn't unload them. Instead, she drove back towards the community hall. She pulled up near the small cluster of families and found Yusuf al-Hassan. "My house," she said, her voice steady and clear. There's space, a yard, water, it's warm. Yusuf stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and profound suspicion. In his world, an offer like this was never without a price. No price, Sarah said, as if reading his mind. Just come, bring everyone. Words spread through the small community in hushed, urgent whispers of Arabic and Pashto. In the dying light of the autumn day, a silent exodus began. One by one, family by family, they emerged from the shadows of the derelict hall and began the half-mile walk to Sarah's property. They carried their few belongings in plastic bags and worn suitcases. It was not a parade of victory, but a quiet, desperate march towards a fragile, uncertain sanctuary. Sarah stood on her porch and watched them arrive, their silhouettes dark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. They filed into her large, tree-lined backyard, a ghost-like procession finding a place on the damp grass. The encampment had begun, and with it, the war for Havenwood's soul. The first 24 hours were a blur of managed chaos. With Yusuf acting as her lieutenant and translator, Sarah orchestrated the creation of a miniature city in her backyard. She made another trip, this time to Walmart, and returned with a dozen four-person tents, a stack of blue tarps, and 2 propane-powered camping stoves. The costs were piling up. She was now living off her savings account, transferring chunks of a few $1,000s at a time to her depleted checking. They set up the tents in a crescent on the flattest part of the yard, under the broad, protective canopy of 2 ancient oak trees. The tarps became a makeshift roof for a communal kitchen area. Sarah ran a heavy-duty extension cord from her back porch, powering a single string of lights and a multi-plug power strip that immediately became the lifeline for charging Phonest, the only connection these families had to the lives and relatives they'd left behind. She established a first aid station in the first tent, her old army medical bag splayed open. Here, she could properly examine Amina. It was bronchitis, as she'd suspected, threatening to become pneumonia. The girl needed antibiotics, and soon, the first volley from the outside world came not as a bang, but as a shrill, indignant voice over a phone line. From her kitchen window, Janice Cowell had watched the tents go up, her face tightening into a knot of outrage. Her 911 call was a masterpiece of suburban panic. "Yes, I need to report a situation." Janice's voice crackled, high and thin. "It's my neighbor, Sarah Jenkins. She's brought them all to her house. There are dozens of them, living in tents in her yard. This is a health hazard. It's a security risk. Who knows what diseases they're carrying? You have to do something." That call led to Officer Miller's first visit, the one with the silent flashing lights and the talk of ordinances. After he left, Janice, realizing the police were not going to storm the property, escalated her campaign. She began a systematic documentation of life in Sarah's yard. Standing on her own porch, she filmed with her phone, providing a running commentary of fear and suspicion which she uploaded directly to the Havenwood Community Watch Facebook page. 10:15 a.m., she wrote under a blurry photo of women cooking. "They are preparing food in open containers. No health standards. The smell is ethnic, very strong." 2:30 p.m., she posted with a video of children playing a simple game with a rock. Unsupervised children running wild, making a terrible racket. What happens when one of them gets hurt on her property? Our property values are going to plummet. The posts were gasoline on a smoldering fire of local anxiety. The comments section became a cesspool of fear-mongering and thinly veiled racism. Councilman Mark Redding, ever the opportunist, saw the digital smoke signals and knew which way the political wind was blowing. He called a press conference on the steps of the town hall. He stood at the podium, a picture of solemn civic duty, his words carefully chosen to stoke fear while maintaining a veneer of respectability. "While our hearts go out to those in difficult situations," Redding announced, his voice resonating with false empathy, "we have a primary and solemn duty to the tax-paying citizens of Havenwood. We must protect public health. We must ensure our zoning ordinances, the very rules that keep our communities safe and orderly air respected. Unregulated, unsanctioned settlements, no matter how well-intentioned, pose a significant risk to our way of life." He never mentioned Sarah by name. He didn't have to. The target was painted, and the siege had officially begun. Life settled into a grueling, relentless rhythm. Sarah's world shrank to the 2 acres of her property and the sterile corridors of the ER. Her days became a meticulous, exhausting exercise in logistics and survival. 5 0 a.m. Alarm. The house is cold. She makes a massive pot of coffee, the cheap bulk buy kind, and drinks the first 2 cups standing over the sink. 5:30 a.m. Outside. The camp is stirring. She helps the women start the propane stoves, beginning the process of making oatmeal and flatbread for 60 people. She moves through the tents. A one-woman public health service, checking on the children, treating a cut here, a cough there. Her gaze always lingers on Amina, whose condition is holding steady but not improving. The need for real medicine is a constant gnawing worry. 7:30 a.m. Shower. She scrubs the grime of the camp off her body, changes into her nursing scrubs, and forces down a piece of toast. A quick check of her bank account. 71,502.14. Another few thousand gone. 8:00 a.m. 8:00 p.m. Her shift at Havenwood Regional. She tries to compartmentalize, to focus on the broken bones and chest pains in front of her. But the hospital, once a refuge of professional purpose, now feels like part of the problem. Her colleagues whisper. They've all seen the Facebook page, the local news. She feels their judgment, their pity, their fear. 8:30 p.m. Home. The work isn't over. She helps clean the dinner dishes, coordinates the garbage disposal. She'd spent $500 to rent 2 portable toilets and a commercial dumpster, and holds her nightly medical clinic in the first aid tent. 11:00 p.m. Collapse into bed. Sleep doesn't come easy. It's filled with anxious dreams of dwindling numbers and the sound of a child's cough. The financial bleed was terrifying. Groceries alone were over $2,000 a week. Propane, toiletries, wet wipes, diaper sit was a constant draining hemorrhage of funds. 62,819.01, 55, 104.77. The numbers on her banking app became a countdown clock to her own personal ruin. One afternoon at the hospital, Dr. Ben Carter, a senior ER doctor with a perpetually cynical expression and a surprisingly good heart, cornered her in the break room. "Jenkins," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I know what you're doing, and I know you're one stubborn SOB who thinks she can save the world with a first aid kit and a Costco card." He took a sip of his stale coffee. "But you're also going to get yourself in a world of legal and financial trouble. More importantly, I saw the chart you're keeping. That little girl with the bronchitis needs real antibiotics, not just whatever you've got in your go bag." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but Ben held up a hand. He glanced down the empty hallway before reaching into his locker and pulling out a plain brown paper bag. He pushed it into her hands. "This is a full course of pediatric amoxicillin, some hydrocortisone cream for the rashes I'm sure you're seeing, and a few EpiPens, just in case. Don't tell anyone where you got these. I like my job." He clapped her on the shoulder. "And for God's sake, be careful." The weight of the bag in her hands was immense, a small, tangible victory in a sea of overwhelming challenges. She had an ally. The next day, the system pushed back again. A crisp white van from the Havenwood Health Department pulled up, followed closely by Officer Miller's cruiser. A stern-faced inspector named Ms. Albright, clipboard in hand, began a meticulous tour of the property. She documented the outdoor kitchen, the hand-washing station made from a water cooler and a bucket, the spacing of the tents. Sarah calmly walked with her, explaining her sterilization procedures using boiled water and bleach, her carefully planned waste disposal system, her daily health screenings. Ms. Albright was impassive, her pen scratching across her forms. "Your intentions are irrelevant, Ms. Jenkins," the inspector said, her voice devoid of emotion. "What I see are 57 individuals residing in an unsanctioned space without access to approved plumbing, food preparation facilities, or waste management services. You are in violation of a dozen county health codes." 2 days later, Officer Miller returned to serve her the official citation. The fines totaled over $10,000. He couldn't meet her eyes as he handed her the paperwork. The battle for Havenwood was being fought not just on Sarah's lawn, but in the hearts and minds of its citizens. The online vitriol was a daily poison, but a quiet countercurrent of compassion began to flow. One evening, Sarah found 2 large bags of groceries on her front porch. There was no note. Another morning, a local teenager on a skateboard rolled down her driveway, tossed a large new tarp onto the lawn, and sped away, yelling, "You rock!" before she could even say thank you. An elderly farmer she didn't know began leaving crates of fresh corn, squash, and potatoes at the end of her driveway twice a week, with a simple, anonymous note tucked under a zucchini. God's work. These small acts were flickers of light in a gathering darkness, reminders that Janice Cowell and Mark Redding did not speak for everyone. They were the fuel that kept her going when her own reserves were running on fumes. But for every act of kindness, there were 10 of hostility. Cars now routinely slowed down as they passed, the occupants shouting insults. "Go home!" they'd yell, a cruel irony lost on them. Someone threw a bag of fast food garbage over her fence, where it split open near the children's play area. Janice Cowell escalated her personal war, installing a blinding, motion-activated security floodlight on the side of her garage. It was aimed directly at Sarah's yard, and it snapped on at the slightest movement, bathing the tents in harsh, invasive light all through the night. The pressure found its way into the last bastion of her old life, the hospital. She was called into the office of Martha Connolly, the hospital administrator, a woman who viewed the world through the lens of liability and public relations. "Sarah, sit down," Martha began, her tone clipped and professional. She folded her hands on her large mahogany desk. "I've been made aware of your extracurricular activities. We've seen the news reports. We've seen the social media chatter. And frankly, the hospital is getting calls." "What kind of calls?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "Concerned citizens?" Martha said evasively. "They wonder why one of our nurses is running what they call an illegal refugee camp." "Sarah, your actions, however well-intentioned, reflect on this institution. We cannot be seen as endorsing this. We have a reputation to maintain. I'm telling you as your supervisor, and as someone who values your work here, you need to end this. It's a liability we cannot afford." The threat was unspoken but crystal clear. Her job, her only remaining source of income, was on the line. She was being systematically isolated from her community, her neighbors, and now her profession. That night, feeling the full weight of that isolation, she sat in the first aid tent, cleaning and reorganizing her dwindling supplies. The flap of the tent pushed open, and Amina Al-Hassan peeked inside. The antibiotics from Ben had worked wonders. The girl's cough was gone, replaced by a shy, vibrant energy. She had become Sarah's little shadow, following her around the camp, helping with small tasks. Now, she held out a piece of paper. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, hopeful crayon. It showed a tall stick figure with a yellow scribble of hair and a stethoscope around her neck. The figure was standing in front of a big, boxy house. In the yard, dozens of smaller stick figures, all with wide, smiling faces, were gathered under a giant, benevolent sun that took up a quarter of the page. Sarah took the drawing, a lump forming in her throat. Amina pointed to the tall figure. "Sarah," she said, her pronunciation soft. Then she pointed to herself, a small figure with a bright pink dress standing next to the nurse. "Amina." Sarah looked from the drawing to the girl's earnest, upturned face. This was the why. This crayon drawing, this small, trusting face, this was the answer to Janice Cowell's floodlight, to Mark Redding's smarmy press conferences, to Martha Connolly's veiled threats. This was the reason to keep fighting. She went inside and taped the drawing to the front of her refrigerator, right in the center. It was her battle standard, her emotional fuel. It was the only thing that felt real in a world that had gone completely mad. The breaking point didn't arrive with a single, dramatic crack. It came as a rapid succession of body blows, a brutal, cascading failure of everything she had tried to build. The first blow was financial. The weekly grocery bill was due. She drove her truck to the ATM at the local credit union, the one she'd used her whole life. She put her card in, punched in her PIN, and requested 500. The machine whirred, clicked, and then spit her card back out. An ominous message flashed on the screen. Transaction cannot be completed. Insufficient funds. Her blood ran cold. That had to be a mistake. She requested a mini statement. The machine whirred again and produced a small, flimsy slip of paper. She stared at it under the flickering fluorescent light of the ATM kiosk. Savings account balance, 21.42. $21.42. She had liquidated a future, bled a life savings dry, for rice and beans and diapers. She stood there for a full minute, the slip of paper trembling in her hand. The number, a final, damning judgment. She was broke. The second blow came from the sky. The weather, which had been crisp and cool, turned with a vengeance. A massive Pacific Northwest storm, the kind the news channels breathlessly dubbed a once-in-a-decade atmospheric river, rolled in off the coast. The wind came first, a low moan that escalated into a shrieking howl, tearing at the trees. Then came the rain. It wasn't a drizzle, it was a deluge, a solid, vertical wall of water that hammered the world. The camp was defenseless. The cheap Walmart tents, not designed for such an onslaught, collapsed one by one. The main tarp over the kitchen area ripped from its moorings and was sent cartwheeling into the dark woods. The yard, her parents' beautiful lawn, dissolved into a quagmire of cold, sucking mud. The world became a maelstrom of wind, water, and misery. Sarah and the families, soaked to the bone, crowded into her small house, the living room, the kitchen, the hallway, a desperate, shivering mass of humanity seeking refuge from the storm's fury. The third blow was delivered the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The sun was out, but it illuminated a battlefield of wrecked tents and debris. As Sarah stood on her porch, surveying the damage with a hollow heart, Officer Miller's cruiser pulled up. He wasn't alone. 2 other officers were with him, their faces grim and unreadable. Miller walked up the muddy path, his boots squelching. He avoided her eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy. "I'm sorry." He handed her a folded official document. It was an eviction notice. Citing the emergency weather conditions as a public health and safety crisis, Councilman Redding had finally gotten the court order he wanted. The document declared her property a biohazard and a public nuisance. They had 24 hours to vacate. Everyone. Redding, never one to miss a moment in the spotlight, was already holding a press conference in front of the town hall. Sarah watched it later on her phone, the battery dwindling. He stood there, oozing concern. "This is a humanitarian intervention," he declared, "to move these unfortunate people to a safer, more appropriate, and state-sanctioned facility." It was a lie. No such facility existed. He was using the storm as his checkmate. The final blow was the cruelest. Janice Cowell, emboldened by the eviction notice, saw her chance for a victory lap. She organized a small but venomous protest at the end of Sarah's driveway. She and a dozen others, mostly faces she recognized from the angriest comments on the Facebook page, held cheap, hand-painted signs. "Enforce our laws. Havenwood is not a refugee camp. Protect our children." They chanted and jeered as the refugees, their faces etched with a new and profound despair, watched from the porch. It was too much. The empty bank account, the ruined camp, the eviction notice, the hate-filled chant, all crashed down on her at once. Sarah turned, walked back into her house, and slid down the kitchen wall until she was sitting on the floor. For the first time since this ordeal began, she broke. She buried her face in her hands and wept, her body shaking with deep, ragged sobs of failure and utter exhaustion. On the refrigerator across from her, Amina's crayon drawing of the smiling sun seemed like a cruel joke. Unseen, a witness was chronicling Sarah's demise. Chloe Zhang was 22, a journalism school graduate with a mountain of student debt and a fierce belief that the real stories were happening in the places the big media vans wouldn't go. She ran a small, independent YouTube channel called Unfiltered, and she'd been following the Havenwood story for a week, disgusted by the mainstream media's detached, both sides narrative. She had avoided the media scrum at the end of the driveway. Instead, she'd parked a mile away and hiked through the dense, wet woods that bordered the back of Sarah's property. Hidden behind a thicket of ferns, her camera's zoom lens was a powerful, unobtrusive eye. She captured it all. The heartbreaking vista of the flooded, mud-caked yard littered with the wreckage of the tents. The somber faces of the refugee families huddled on the porch. The ugly, triumphant spectacle of Janice's protest at the end of the driveway. And then, the shot that would change everything. Through the kitchen window, she filmed Sarah Jenkins, the hero nurse, sliding to the floor, her shoulders shaking in a moment of raw, private despair. Chloe felt tears welling in her own eyes. This wasn't a story about zoning ordinances. It was a story about a woman being broken by a cruel and indifferent system. She retreated to her car, her heart pounding with a mixture of sorrow and journalistic adrenaline. She transferred the footage to her laptop. She didn't bother with fancy graphics or a voiceover. She edited the raw clips together, the images telling their own devastating story. She typed out a simple, powerful title: "Hero Nurse Who Spent Savings on Refugees is Evicted as They Freeze in Mud." She uploaded it to YouTube, adding a string of hashtags: Havenwood Crisis, Let Them Stay, Sarah Jenkins, Humanity. She posted the link to Twitter, tagging several high-profile human rights activists and international news outlets. Then she leaned back in her driver's seat, her hands trembling, and waited. For an hour, nothing happened. The view count sat at 47. Then, it jumped to 300. Then 500. A well-known actress with 12 million followers retweeted the link with the comment, "This is America in 2025. Shame on you, Havenwood." The digital wildfire had been lit. The video exploded. It bypassed the local news filters and shot straight into the national and then the international consciousness. The view counter spun like a slot machine. 100, 0, 500, 0, a million. It was being played in newsrooms in New York, on phones in London, on tablets in Berlin. The raw, unfiltered honesty of Chloe's footage, the mud, the protest, the tear shad, struck a universal nerve. The story of the stubborn nurse in a small Oregon town was no longer a local issue. It was a global symbol, and the world was watching. The morning of the eviction dawned gray and cold, the air thick with unspoken dread. Noon was the deadline. Sarah felt hollowed out, scoured clean of tears and anger, left with only a grim, quiet resolve. She would not ask the families to leave. She would stand on her porch and wait. They would have to arrest her. They would have to drag all of them away in front of the cameras that were now gathered in force at the end of her driveway. She stood on the top step of her porch, a silent sentinel. Yusuf and Layla al-Hassan stood on either side of her, a small, dignified honor guard. The children were inside, quiet. The police were already assembling, their cars forming a neat, official blockade. Councilman Mark Redding had arrived, his face a mask of smug satisfaction as he prepared to personally oversee the cleanup for the media. And Janice Cowell and her protesters were back, their signs held high, their faces glowing with vicious victory. The scene was set for the final, humiliating act. And then came the sound. It began as a low, deep thrum, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It was an unfamiliar sound, cutting through the morning quiet. Everyone, the cops radioing each other, Redding adjusting his tie for the cameras, Janice starting a chant, paused, looking around in confusion. The rumbling grew steadily, resolving into the unmistakable, deafening roar of powerful engines. It wasn't coming from the road, it was coming from the sky. Every head tilted upwards. Breaking through the low gray cloud cover was an aircraft of impossible size and menace. It was a C-130 Hercules, a 4-engine military transport plane flying impossibly low over the suburban landscape of Havenwood. It was painted a stark, clinical white, and on its high tail fin, 2 letters were emblazoned in bold black print, UN. The plane wasn't lining up with the local airfield. It was lining up with Sarah Jenkins's property. The roar became overwhelming as it flew directly overhead. Then, the rear cargo door yawned open. A series of dark shapes emerged, blossoming into large olive-drab parachutes. They drifted downwards with an eerie, silent precision. The first pallet landed with a soft, heavy thud in the middle of Sarah's muddy yard, not 50 feet from where she stood. Stenciled on the side of the weatherproof container, the iconic blue laurel wreath logo surrounded the letters, UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Another pallet landed beside it. This one was marked World Food Program. A third followed, UNICEF. Pallets of heavy-duty, all-weather family tents. Mobile medical kits. Boxes of high-energy biscuits and therapeutic food. Water purification systems. Solar-powered lanterns. A full-scale, professional humanitarian aid package, the kind deployed to war zones and disaster areas, was being airdropped onto a 2-acre lot in small-town America. On the ground, there was absolute, stunned silence. The only sound was the fading roar of the C-130 as it banked steeply and vanished back into the clouds. Mark Redding's jaw was slack, his carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces of disbelief and public humiliation. Janice Cowell stood frozen, her protest sign hanging limply at her side. Officer Miller, his hand half raised to his radio, just stared, his mind unable to process what he had just witnessed. The refugees, who had seen planes like this before usually dropping bombs, were looking up at the sky, their faces streaked with tears of a different kind. Sarah Jenkins, broke, exhausted, and evicted, looked at the impossible bounty that had just fallen from the sky. She looked at the pallets of hope sitting in her ruined yard. She looked at the stunned, idiotic faces of her tormentors. And she let out a single, sharp laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated, cathartic relief that cut through the silence like a bolt of lightning. The UN Airlift was more than a delivery of supplies. It was a devastatingly effective act of political theater. A quiet, non-verbal statement of shame delivered from 10 feet, triggered by the viral firestorm of Chloe's video, and frantic, high-level pressure from international aid organizations who saw an opportunity to make a powerful point. The unprecedented maneuver had checkmated not just Councilman Redding, but the entire facade of American indifference. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. The local media scrum was suddenly dwarfed by the arrival of the international press. CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, their satellite trucks, clogged the narrow road leading to Sarah's house. The story was no longer about a local zoning dispute. It was about the failure of a superpower, a story of how one woman's stubborn compassion had forced the hand of the world. Mark Redding's victory press conference became his public execution. As he tried to flee the town hall, he was cornered by a sharp-eyed BBC reporter. "Councilman Redding," she asked, her British accent making the question sound even more damning, "given that the United Nations has just delivered aid to your town as if it were a failed state, do you still believe your office's response to this crisis has been adequate?" Redding stammered, his face pale and sweating. He mumbled something about jurisdiction and protocols before pushing through the cameras and all but running to his car. His political career was over. He would resign in disgrace less than 48 hours later. The mood in Havenwood turned on a dime. Shamed by the global spotlight, the town's vocal opposition melted away. The Community Watch Facebook page was overrun by a tidal wave of comments from around the world, denouncing the town's cruelty. Janice Cowell became an overnight pariah. The next morning, when she went to get her newspaper, her other neighbor, a man who had previously been silent, simply stared at her from his own driveway and shook his head in disgust before turning his back. The shunning was as silent and total as the UN Airlift. Guilt was a powerful motivator. People who had watched silently from their windows for weeks now showed up at Sarah's driveway, their arms laden with food, blankets, and offers of help. Their apologies were palpable. The airlift forced the hands of state and federal officials who had been happy to let the problem fester. Within hours, the governor was on the phone. FEMA was activated. The supplies from the UN were used as the foundation to establish a proper, well-funded temporary shelter at the county fairgrounds, the very thing Redding had claimed was impossible. Amidst the chaos, Sarah found herself at the center of a new reality. Chloe, the young vlogger, had started a GoFundMe page for her titled, "Help Nurse Sarah Rebuild." It hit its goal of 100,000 in 3 hours. By the end of the week, it had topped $500,000. Sarah was invited Sumunetto be a civilian consultant on a new regional task force for refugee settlement. She had gone from being a town pariah to its unwilling moral compass. A few weeks later, a semblance of a new normal had settled over Havenwood. The camp in Sarah's yard was gone, the mud replaced by newly laid turf, paid for by a local landscaping company free of charge. The refugees were housed in the clean, orderly rows of heated tents at the fairgrounds, receiving proper care and processing from federal agencies. The day came for the Al-Hassan family to leave. Thanks to the intense public scrutiny on their case, their asylum claim had been fast-tracked. They were being relocated to Seattle, where Yusuf had a potential job lined up with a contracting firm that had heard his story. The goodbye took place on Sarah's front porch. It was awkward and emotional, freighted with all the things that couldn't be said. Layla hugged her, whispering, "Shukran, shukran," over and over. Yusuf, ever the stoic patriarch, shook her hand firmly, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You did not just give us food and a place to sleep, Sarah," he said, his English careful and precise. "In that place we had lost everything. We were becoming ghosts. You saw us. You gave us back our dignity." Amina was last. She didn't say anything. She just launched herself at Sarah, wrapping her small arms around her waist in a fierce, clinging hug that spoke volumes. When she finally let go, she pressed a small, smooth stone into Sarah's palm before running back to her parents. Sarah watched them get into the government van that would take them to their new life, and she stood there until it was just a speck down the road. 3 months passed. Autumn gave way to the deep chill of winter. Sarah was back at work in the ER, but everything was different. She was no longer just another nurse. She was a local legend, a reluctant celebrity. She used the GoFundMe money to pay off the mortgage on her house and put the rest into a non-profit she'd started with Ben Carter's help. The Havenwood Project, dedicated to providing rapid, no-questions-asked assistance to displaced people in the region. The rage that had fueled her for weeks had subsided, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of purpose. That evening, she sat alone in her quiet kitchen. The house was hers again, but the yard beyond the window felt different. It wasn't just a patch of grass. It was a place where something impossible had happened. It felt bigger now, holier. Her gaze fell upon the crayon drawing still taped to her refrigerator door. The smiling stick figures, the giant, happy sun. She thought of the empty bank account, the hateful signs, the soul-crushing exhaustion. And she thought of the roar of a C-130, the impossible sight of parachutes blooming against a gray sky. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. She had lost her savings but found her soul. She had learned that in a world full of petty tyrants and crushing indifference, the stubborn, simple refusal to look away could, against all odds, move mountains. Or, in her case, call down a miracle from the sky.